Welcome to the Joe Green JFK podcast, number 2. I'm calling this one the Cancellation of Louis Ferdinand-Celine, and the reason I'm calling it that will become clear in a little while. Some things have been going through my head, which is what this podcast is all about. Before I get into Celine, I wanted to start off with a little comment about Martin Luther King. Dave Chappelle, in one of his recent shows, did a bit about MLK, and he said that if Martin Luther King had had a sneaker contract, and he definitely would have a sneaker contract if he was around today, that we would still be at the back of the bus. Dave's point being that Martin Luther King would go and say things that were controversial, and his sneaker company, Adidas or Nike or whatever, would get him into a room and say, hey, listen, Martin, we really love being associated with you, and you're doing great work, but we need you to tone it down just a little bit. You're being a little bit extreme. It'd be great if you could stop doing that. Be a little bit less controversial. We're going mainstream now, and we need you to appeal to everybody. And then Martin Luther King would say, I thought the whole reason that you guys wanted me here was because I say controversial stuff. And the guy from the sneaker corporation would say, sure, yeah, absolutely. We just want you to be a little bit less. The same deal that Michael Jordan made, right? Michael Jordan said Republicans buy shoes too. And it got me thinking about how much all of us at one time or another are products of the time that we live in. But that there are certain universals that go through civilization to civilization. They're very hard to parse out. But most of us, I think, have an innate sense of what those kind of things are. They have to do with what they call pro-social behavior. Family, community, friends, that sort of thing. Caring about one another. It's the whole point of society. A couple of years ago, I wrote this article for Microcosm Publishing as part of a zine that they were putting out by several different writers, and it was called Against Cancellation. And the way I chose to start that article was to talk about something that happened to Martin Luther King, which was that in the late 1957 through like Christmas of 1958, Dr. King wrote an advice column for Ebony magazine. The column tended to be about topics that he normally spoke about, peace and protests and the foolishness of hate. He also received one letter that he chose to write about in his column, and it was a young man who asked him for help. And the young man said, I feel about boys the way I ought to feel about girls. This is Dr. King's reply. I'm quoting Dr. King now. The type of feeling that you have toward boys is probably not an innate tendency, but something that has been culturally acquired. Your reasons for adopting this habit have now been consciously suppressed or unconsciously repressed. Therefore, it is necessary to deal with this problem by getting back to some of the experiences and circumstances that led to the habit. In order to do this, I would suggest that you see a good psychiatrist who can assist you in bringing to the forefront of conscience all of those experiences and circumstances that led to the habit. Where we are in 2021, that's obviously an unacceptable response. Right? Dr. King is writing from a framework of heteronormativity. He's assuming that boys belong with girls, girls belong with boys, and that's all there is to it. And he's irreverent. He's coming out of the church tradition. So it's not surprising that he has this attitude. This attitude also extended, unfortunately, to one of his good friends, Bayard Rustin, who was a very significant figure in the civil rights movement, but who Dr. King put to the side numerous times because of his sexuality. I think it's also very interesting that Dr. King, I mean, you could tell this was written in 1957 or 1958 because of the reliance on Freudian psychology. The other interesting thing I think he writes, and I pointed to it, is that King says that homosexuality is culturally conditioned. How fascinating is that? I mean, he was ahead of his time, and he was also behind his time at the same time. He believed in cultural conditioning, but unlike your average college student in 2021, he did not believe that heteronormativity is culturally conditioned, or that, say, a marriage between a man and a woman is culturally conditioned, or male behavior is culturally conditioned. He said homosexuality is culturally conditioned. I think that perspective tells us something. It should also raise another question in ourselves, which is that as human beings, we are unlikely to be possessed of 100% of the whole truth all the time. And it therefore behooves us to treat the past with a certain respect. It doesn't have to be reverence. We can certainly disagree with things that go on in the past. But we should understand that everyone is coming from a particular point of view at a particular point in the line of time, and that therefore have access to different kinds of information that affect all of the judgments that are made during that time. I should also mention that even in 1958, the world was dangerous for Dr. King. He was stabbed by a woman named Isola Curry in a really strange incident that is not well known and not often brought up in the context of King's life. But when we say that things are dangerous, what King did was extremely dangerous, and what he was going to do got even more dangerous after 1958. And they got supremely dangerous in 1967 when he finally started to speak out about the war, which earned him a public execution from the government in April of 1968. He was a dangerous thinker and a dangerous writer, and he may have been right or wrong about certain things, but he was pushing at the margins of history and pushing the envelope of thought. And I think that has significant value, even if we find ourselves disagreeing with some aspects of his thought. We recognize the position that he's coming from, and we understand that some of the beliefs that he had were doctrinaire and that were associated with his position. And we say, well, we don't agree with that, but we agree with other things. Now to the subject of what I really wanted to talk about for most of this podcast. I wanted to talk about Louis Ferdinand-Celine. Celine was a French writer. He was born in 1894, spent most of his childhood in Paris. And he famously wrote, he wrote numerous books, but the two books that tend to get pointed to as enormous influences on certain writers was his first one, Voyage à bout de la nuit, Journey to the End of the Night, and his second novel, Meurtre à crédit, which was Death on the Installment Plan. And if you will forgive my French as I go through this thing, my pronunciations may not be perfect. The reason I wanted to talk about Celine is, first of all, I guess I should talk about how I first encountered Celine, which I actually don't remember how I got onto him. I suspect the writings of William S. Burroughs put me onto him. William S. Burroughs, of course, was one of the beat writers, a group that includes people like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. Kerouac was a huge devotee of Celine, And you can find a video on YouTube of him speaking about Celine in French. But he also inspired, along with, I would say, the French playwright and novelist Jean Genet, inspired a lot of the novels that came out of the sort of seedier side of American culture, particularly in the 50s and 60s. That would include William S. Burroughs and his writings like Junkie and Naked Lunch, but also Nelson Algren's The Man with a Golden Arm, and Walking the Wild Side, and Hubert Selby's Last Exit to Brooklyn. Books that were willing to take life on in all of its dirty glory. And I don't mean dirty in a sexual sense, although there was certainly that, but in a physical sense. It was a rawness to the writing and an obsession at times with fecal matter and guts and vomit and what happens at 2 a.m. when you're trying to kick heroin and you're trying to get money from a guy who doesn't want to give it to you, and what it means to live a desperate life. And it's not that this wasn't covered in novels before this, but Celine's prose has an energy to it, a kick. It kind of grabs you by the shirt tails and says, listen to me. And Celine loves exclamation points. And he loves to go on and on about the human condition and how terrible it is and how terrible human beings are. And he's passing judgment, but at the same time, he is one of the group that he is judging to be lousy. He thinks that human beings are mostly useless, and he tends to include himself in that valuation. The first book, Journey to the End of the Night, I read that novel, I guess when I was probably 20, maybe, somewhere around there. And it obviously made a huge impact on me because when I started to write screenplays, one of the first projects that I took on as a writing assignment, as a writing practice, was to adapt. I adapted Journey as a screenplay. And it still exists. I have it here. Well, I don't have the whole thing. I have about 50 or 60 pages worth that survived 30 years or so as an adaptation. And it wouldn't work for numerous reasons. That's why no film has ever been made of Journey to the End of the Night, besides the fact that Americans would hate it. I am loath to quote Alan Bloom on any subject, but Bloom was correct when he said that Journey to the End of the Night was in some ways designed to be hated by the typical American. It is as unsentimental a work as ever been written, and actually maybe unsentimental soft pedals it kind of. But it also mirrors what happened to Celine. So I mentioned that he was born in 1894. He enlisted in the army in 1912 and fought in the First World War. And anyone who fought in the bloodbath that was the First World War can be forgiven for having a negative outlook about human beings from then on. And indeed, he writes like somebody with PTSD, which I'm sure he had, which they used to call shell shock in those days. Celine actually received an award, the Medal Militaire, I think it's called, in 1914, and he was shot in the head and in his arm. He was pretty severely wounded, and this colored everything, all of his experiences from then on. So Journey to the End of the Night is basically an autobiographical novel, and it covers the point in his life when he was in the army and he fought in World War I. Although he describes himself as a coward who runs away from every battle. And the character whose name is Bardamu in the book meets a man called Robinson, and they become best friends because of their mutual cowardice. Robinson says, he wished that he could have been captured by a German soldier, and Bardamu says he wants the same thing. He wished that you were German so that you could have arrested me. And I could have said, all right, I'll spend the rest of the war in a camp. And this cowardice extends to not only the violence of the war, but the violence of cooking food. There's a description of a slaughter that happens, and Bartholomew recoils from that the same way that he recoils from the battle. And he talks about the cynicism and the depravity of the officers that are sending all of these young men into battle to be killed. And in some ways, I guess it's a precursor to some extent of Catch-22, although the scenarios are less elaborate. It's mostly about, these colonels tell them to do these awful things, and you're more or less forced to do them at some level. And after the war, Bartholomew and Robinson remain friends, and they have various adventures. But the central action in the book is that Bartholomew admires Robinson because of his refusal to be involved with other human beings. He's consistent with his negative image of other human beings. And so much so that Robinson chooses to be shot to death by the woman who loves him rather than accept the love that she wants to give to him. In other words, he is so disgusted with the human race that he will not accept love and chooses death instead. And that's the last thing that happens in the book. You might say, well, why? What the hell kind of message is that? Like, what am I reading this for? For one thing, Celine's prose is charged. I mean, he's a really funny writer, and he's acerbic and acidic in his observations. You read a page and just kind of shake your head and say, Jesus. But then you laugh, and also notice that he's very observant, that Celine is correctly observing human behavior. And the behavior is familiar if you have been out in the world and seen how power structures work and you've ever been desperate. He wrote a second novel, Death on the Installment Plan, Mort à crédit, Death on Credit. And this is where he adopted his famous use of the ellipsis. And if you just pick up the book, most people sort of go, what the hell is this? Because there are these long paragraphs and enormously long sentences that are broken up by ellipsis after ellipsis, like a continued thought, like a guy that's, you've handed the madman a microphone and he starts yelling a lot of incoherent things. Except that you notice that there's a lot of coherent things along with those incoherent things. And what Death on the Installment Plan covers is Celine's early childhood, which was apparently pretty terrible. Gave him a real taste of the terrors of humanity and the desperation of humanity that he would carry with him the rest of his life. Now, I have his first 4 novels. I have Journey, I have Death on the Installment Plan, I have Castle to Castle, and I have Guignol's Band. And Guignol's Band covers there's a point in his life where he went to Africa for a while, and that book is mostly about that. So from that African experience, Celine hates all forms of colonialism. He grows to hate all of that. The trouble with Celine. Now, I've mentioned how his books were enormously influential to beat writers like William S. Burroughs, and this is absolutely true. His books have been in print ever since. But there's also a problem with Celine, which is that when World War II came along, Celine published tracts that were wildly anti-Semitic and encouraged the Germans to get rid of Jewish people. In fact, his work was so over the top in this direction that one of the chancellors of propaganda for the Third Reich asked him to tone it down a little bit. You can't be, we're trying to be a little subtle here. Which is incredible considering the types of propaganda that Goebbels and others did publish. Celine's was more excessive than that even, which it was. He was, by all accounts, a pretty miserable person and never really came to terms with that. And he was, in some sense, canceled for those beliefs. Although, it's obviously it was a different age. And it's a big check mark against Celine's overall character and his work, the same way that it is for like Ezra Pound and other writers who ended up being outed as anti-Semitic. The difference with Celine, though, is that he, got up to the front of the band and painted a flag and started leading the charge and said, "Yay, yay, yay," which is not that surprising if you read Celine's other work. He's wild in all directions. So, the question is his work useful in any sense, even though he had this wildly anti-Semitic position that even the Third Reich was uncomfortable with him being publicizing? As I've said, he inspired a whole bunch of other writers, along with, Jean Genet, who was equally disreputable in his own fashion, and as great a writer, too, I think. Disreputable fiction from that point forward would always owe a debt of gratitude to Celine, and obviously it affected me enough when I was, like I say, 20, 21, 22, to attempt to write a screenplay version of the book, which I knew it would only be a work practice, because you could never make a film about Journey to the End of the Night because it's way too expensive, right? You'd have to spend a whole bunch of money depicting World War I for a story and a conclusion that audiences will hate. Audiences are going to hate the character, who's a coward, and not a lovable coward. This is not Falstaff, or as Eddie Izzard pointed out, Scooby-Doo, right? Scooby-Doo is a lovable dog who's a coward. Very rare in fiction to have a hero coward, which also reminds me, my friend James we were all chatting around a table, and there was a pause in the conversation, and my friend James suddenly said, "Scooby-Doo, well, not a genius." And he just trailed off because we all started laughing hysterically. And the reason I thought it was funny, I think the reason everybody thought it was funny, is because Scooby-Doo has an essential paradox, which is that a talking dog is obviously brilliant, but everything the dog says is idiotic. Anyway, that's the essential paradox of Scooby-Doo, the wonders of a dog who talks, but only says banalities and stupidities and is obsessed with food and running away. That's not too far from Celine. Bardamu, in that first novel, is obsessed with eating and running away. And sex. He likes sex too. The appetites. The grosser the better. There are scenes in his work which are so well realized that it's very easy for me to think of them now. And I had little visual jokes and things in the screenplay to try to replicate some of that. But Old Louis, I think, is one of the great novelists, certainly of the 20th century. But I think he's one of the great novelists, period. Despite the fact that he was totally disreputable and possibly nuts. And certainly hateful. And it was that hate that stirred him on. Which is basically the thesis of... there's a French writer called Michel Houellebecq, who is violently right-wing and has written a lot of terrible things about Muslims, but he's also patterned his life somewhat on Celine. Not somewhat. When he started his novel Atomized, and then he wrote a novel called The Elementary Particles, which I thought was great. Maybe early 90s, late 80s, something like that. And he was like the enfant terrible, right? That was his whole thing. It was his shtick. And he was this Celine-like writer. Well, and he, like Celine, as he's gotten older, he's gotten more right-wing, virulent in his hatred. Well, although Celine's harder to nail down because, and I don't even think like political discourse is not the right language to use in assessing Louis. He wasn't political in that sense. He was the man in his books, his letters, his ideas, they're driven by these enormous appetites and strong opinions in one direction or another. And like I say, Guignol's band makes it very clear that he hates colonialism, but not for necessarily noble reasons. I mean, the same way that he would, hate Jewish people. It's not like it's driven by some sort of internal logic. He's just not. Logic is just not what he does. That is not his. That's not his game. But at the same time, he makes observations that I think are quite brilliant. And in fact, one of the things that Celine really drives home in his work is the fate of all materialist philosophy. In Celine's mind, a scientist or a materialist is a doomsayer of rot, right? A high priest of putrefaction. That's what a materialist scientist is for Celine. It's as pointless an activity as anything else. And this lack of the transcendent goes all through his work, right? There's no transcendence available when you're in the shit in World War II, getting shot at by your own guys because it's so wildly chaotic. And the world is wildly chaotic. The world is kind of like, in some ways, it's influenced by or akin to Voltaire's Candide, which, if you're familiar with the story, Candide is a book about a guy who believes that the world couldn't be any better. A guy named Dr. Pangloss. He says this is the best of all possible worlds. Anyway, the guy gets his ass shot off, literally, like he loses a cheek. All kinds of crazy things happen. And he keeps repeating, this is the best of all possible worlds. Well, Celine is the rejection of that. Voltaire's Candide is a satire. Celine has dropped the satire and is just saying, look at the ship. Like, this is existence. As much as anything else is existence, this. My relationship to Celine is that I still love his novels, despite the fact that I'm sure if I had met him in person, I probably wouldn't have been able to stand him, because he seems like the sort of person who would get very tiring very quickly. And of course, he is violently right-wing, which is not going to fly with me. But at the same time, I think his literary output has enormous value. It obviously has enormous historical value. And he also represents an aspect of humanity which is obsessed with pushing at the borders of acceptable behavior and social acceptance. See, I think that the world needs Evel Knievels in every direction. I think that the world is in big trouble when everybody plays ball and everybody agrees on what the rules are and nobody cheats. We have to push at these things. So there's this, speaking of paradoxes, right? There's a strange paradox that we need, in order to have a functioning society, we have to have most of the people agreeing to abide by the normal rules of civility and social behavior. But at the same time, we also need people like Hunter S. Thompson to grab life by the balls and ride it out for their entire existence. And the reason we need that is because we need to have these signifiers, just like we need some people to be monks and shut themselves away and be cloistered from sin. We need people to sin and to define what sin looks like. Humanity encompasses every type of behavior, including the most animalistic. And in fact, I think Celine is closer to the truth than a lot of other writers who ignore the essentially base appetites of our reptilian brains, the base desires, the animal instincts. All of us have them. All of us suppress them at some point. And this is mostly for the good. I am not at all arguing that people shouldn't be civil. But we do need writers to try and define what that civility is, and to propose that there are things that are lies inherent in civility, and that there are times for incivility. even if we disagree with them 100%. I mean, I find in my life that reading the things that I disagree with tend to be more fulfilling than a book where I agree with all the opinions but don't learn anything new in that regard. Life is more than just slogans or joining the same team or learning the ritual dances that all the other kids learn in our circles. If we're trying to educate ourselves, we have to educate ourselves about everything, including things that are distasteful to us. And one of the most important reasons for that, I think, is that we have to overcome certain internal biases. And I am not talking about biases that are culturally conditioned. For example, we all, every human being, has to deal with a severe bias to the present, meaning that we have a tendency to interpret the world not only from our point of view as an existent being on this earth from a particular location at a particular time, but that literally the present, at this moment. You know, there's this comment that the young generation always thinks that it's invented sex, right? That all sexual relations are new. I see this all the time on Twitter. When I go to Twitter and people are talking about various things, people say, oh, you know, foot fetishes are culturally conditioned or whatever. And they obviously don't know the history of foot fetishes because they're not something that came up 5 years ago. I mean, if you read the Hebrew Bible, one of the points that's repeated over and over again in the Code of Hammurabi is don't sleep with the animals, because you'd have these shepherds and there'd be long cold nights and you'd have a bunch of sheep, and what are you going to do, right? It's 3 a.m, you can't sleep, you're lonely, you sleep with a sheep. Okay, so there are a lot of provisos in the Pentateuch against not doing that. Like stop with the sheep already. So obviously we don't have that now. We have it. I mean, some people do, right? But it wasn't invented 20 minutes ago. Almost every type of human behavior wasn't invented 20 minutes ago. We should know that there are historical precedents for almost everything that happens now. We should also be suspicious that we, in this present moment, because we have the bias of the present, that we are therefore morally superior to the humans that existed on the planet before we ever came along. I mean, wouldn't it be lucky in all the millennia that there have been humans on this planet? There are disagreements, but thousands and thousands of years at minimum, right? That we, this little sliver of time, call it the 21st century, we have been singularly gifted to assess the morality of every human being on the planet and cancel them. How do we make these assessments? Because most people don't have any kind of criteria by which they make these sort of pronouncements. When someone is murdered, we don't go to court and have the lawyer argue that we must weigh the pain of the murdered person against the pleasure that the murderer received from doing the murder. We say, Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, I know my guy killed this lady, but he really likes killing people, especially strangers, and he got a lot of pleasure out of this. And I think you need to recognize the fact that he really, really wanted to do this, and maybe weigh that against the lady that was killed. That may all sound preposterous, but let's take another example. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan's government in the United States chose to invade Grenada, a tiny island, because they had elected a slightly socialist government. And we sent in the Marines because they had done this. The arguments were not that we have no right to be on foreign soil. The arguments were, well, if we let Grenada go socialist, maybe these other places will go socialist too. Which is not far off from arguing that the murderer derives great pleasure from killing, and that should be taken into account in our moral judgments. Or to put it another way, We don't assume that if Rhode Island elects a right-wing government, that Russia has the right to invade Rhode Island and turn it communist. Nobody ever would ever make that argument. But we do say that if an individual human being has committed thought crime, has said something bad or something that everybody disagrees with, that person should be deplatformed and should be excluded from the conversation. And the basic problem with that line of thought is that we are cutting out our culture and throwing it in the trash for the most part. Because if you never think or say anything controversial, then you are very unlikely to produce great art. I was talking to somebody the other day about this topic, and the way I put it was, do Christians make the best music? My answer would be no. I think most people would say no. Even Christians. I think most Christians would say that Christian music is incredibly formulaic, tends to sound absolutely the same, no matter who the artist is, and can be identified by certain production techniques which are immediately discernible. And I would venture to say that your average Christian listens to Dua Lipa a lot more than they listen to Christian music. Maybe not. Anyway, the point is that we're excluding people who have sinned. However you end up defining what that sin is, you are inevitably cutting out enormous parts of the actual culture. And I don't mean cancel culture, because I dislike the phrase. I dislike any phrase that attaches some term to culture and makes it a thing, because usually the term involved doesn't constitute an actual culture. So, despicable people make great art, is what I'm saying. Not all the time. Not all the time. But a lot of the time they do. And I'm not saying that they should be forgiven in a moral sense. If somebody commits a crime, they should be, going to jail and paying their debt to society or whatever it is that they're doing. I have no problem with that. But they are still allowed to make art. And in fact, we need them to make art. We need William S. Burroughs. We need disreputable people. I don't know how many folks have read Naked Lunch out there, but pretty tough going. Or J.G. Ballard's Crash, which I barely was able to finish. That's how rough the language was. It's not the language, it's the concepts, the point of view. It's very difficult. Celine is too. Celine basically says the world is shit. He does it in a really funny way, but he still says the world is shit. And on the way, he gets there by making very clever observations about human behavior that I think make a lot of sense and that I think are valuable. I think it's very unlikely that humanity has reached the pinnacle of moral judgment in the last 20 years, and that therefore everything good has come out in the last 20 years, and that we can therefore divorce ourselves from the past by saying that it's part of the Western canon. And most people don't deal with the realities of this because they're not looking at texts that seriously go after these points. I'll give you a great example. I've written about the Civil Rights Movement and Black history, in particular the history of the Black Panthers. I have a zine about that, but I've written numerous articles on the subject, and it's something that I'm very interested in. Let me give you one example. Soul on Ice. It's a book by Eldridge Cleaver, and it was written while he was in Folsom State Prison, 1965, right? Came out a few years later. Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice is absolutely one of the most important texts of the decade and in Black history, African American history. And Eldridge, in this book, at the very beginning, is talking about how he ended up in prison and what he was doing. Eldridge raped white women, and he very specifically raped white women because he was getting one over on the man. He was angry at the history of the slave trade in the United States. He was angry that he was in the position that he was in, and he chose to dole out this punishment to random white women in the form of rape. Is Eldridge canceled? There is no question that if Eldridge Cleaver had published that book today, well, it wouldn't be published. I mean, not in that form. They would have taken all that stuff out. But do we forgive Eldridge Cleaver? Because Soul on Ice, I think, is a great book too. And it's absolutely fascinating when you get from point A to point B to the transformation of this particular individual going through the civil rights era, dealing with the FBI's COINTEL program, and coming out on the other side of that. So what do we do with that text? Is that text simply canceled because this is not even speculation. This is not like, he was watching dirty anime or something or speculating about things. This is a physical crime, an act that he committed and that he says he committed specifically for political purposes. What do we think? Do we throw that out? I think we do now. I think that if the book comes out now, he would be hated around the world, right? Or he would be hated in America. He would be less defined by his blackness and more defined by his masculinity, which is obviously toxic, and it obviously was toxic because he committed these acts. But when you try to make a defense for Eldridge, I can just see Twitter now with people trying to defend Soul on Ice and other people canceling those people for trying to defend it and saying, you're a rape apologist, right? Including, by the way, Eldridge's lawyer. He had a Jewish lawyer whom he married. So, obviously, she came to terms with it at some level with Eldridge. I think it's a good question. And I think we should be suspicious of pronouncements in which we declare ourselves to be morally superior to anyone else. It's unlikely. We are all, at some level, animals, and at some level, we are all transcendent beings. I think both can be true at the same time. I think humanity has hate and love in equal measure and can express those things in varying quantities, depending on the human being. I'm not saying we have to endorse everything, but we should accept that humans are going to behave like humans, and that we should know that maybe we don't have the same challenges that they had, and that maybe our choices wouldn't have been so different if we had been in that same situation. I think that the most important thing that anybody can come to terms with in their own life is to say, I don't know. I think, but I don't know. And that's what I think about Louis Celine and Eldridge Cleaver and about a whole bunch of other writers, because if you read Naked Lunch, woof. And Burroughs, of course, shot his wife. That's a whole other story, but we can talk about that later. And I think that's probably a good place to stop. Send me a note if you like something, you don't like something. I'd love to hear from you. This is, again, kind of an experiment for me. And we'll see how it goes. So, all right. See you later. Take care.